Section A, it was said, do not commit adultery, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. The history of a people. General Audience number 35 of August 13th, 1980. We must carry out the analysis of Christ's statement in the Sermon on the Mount that refers to adultery and to lustful desire, which he calls adultery committed in the heart, by beginning with the first words. Christ says, you have heard that it was said, you shall not commit adultery, Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. He has in mind the commandment of God, the sixth in the Decalogue. It is part of the so-called second tablet of the law, which Moses received from God Yahweh. Let us first take the point of view to the direct listeners of the Sermon on the Mount, of those who heard Christ's words. They are sons and daughters of the chosen people, the people who had received the law from God Yahweh himself, that had received also the prophets, who had repeatedly in the course of centuries reproached precisely the people's relation to this law, the many transgressions of the law. Christ too speaks about similar transgressions, but even more so, he speaks about a human interpretation of the law that cancels and does away with the right meaning of good and evil specifically willed by the divine legislator. The law is, in fact, above all a means, an indispensable means in order that justice may superabound, the words of Matthew 5, verse 20 in the Old Translation. Christ wants such justice to exceed, literally abound more than that of the scribes and Pharisees. He does not accept the interpretation they had given in the course of the centuries to the authentic content of the law, inasmuch as they, in some measure, subjected this content, or the purpose and will of the legislator, to the various forms of weakness and the limits of the human will that derive precisely from the threefold concupiscence. It was a casuistic interpretation that had superimposed itself on the original vision of good and evil connected with the law of the Decalogue. If Christ strives for a transformation of ethos, he does so above all to recover the fundamental clarity of interpretation. Quote, do not think that I have come to abolish the law of the prophets. I have not come to abolish, but to fulfill. Matthew chapter 5, verse 17. The condition for fulfillment is correct understanding. And this applies, among others, to the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. If one follows the history of the chosen people in the pages of the Old Testament from the time of Abraham, one finds abundant facts that attest to how this commandment was put into practice, and how, as a consequence of this practice, the casuistic interpretation of the law was worked out. First of all, the history of the Old Testament is clearly the theater of the systematic defection from monogamy, which must have had a fundamental significance for the understanding of the prohibition, you shall not commit adultery. The abandonment of monogamy, especially at the time of the patriarchs, was dictated by the desire for offspring, for numerous offspring. This desire was so deep, and procreation as the essential end of marriage was so evident that wives who loved their husbands, when they were unable to give them offspring, on their own initiative asked their husbands who loved them if they could take on their own knees or receive children born of another woman, for example, those of a serving woman, a slave. This was the case with Sarah and Abraham from Genesis chapter 16, verse 2, or with Rachel and Jacob from Genesis chapter 30, verse 3. These two narratives reflect the moral climate in which the Decalogue was practiced. They illustrate the way in which Israelite ethos was prepared to receive the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, and how this commandment was applied in the most ancient tradition of this people. The authority of the patriarchs was, in fact, the highest in Israel, and had a religious character. It was strictly tied to the covenant and the promise. The commandment, you shall not commit adultery, did not change this tradition. Everything indicates that its further development did not limit itself to the rather exceptional motives that had guided the behavior of Abraham and Sarah, or of Jacob and Rachel. If we take as an example the most illustrious representatives of Israel after Moses, namely the kings of Israel, David, and Solomon, the description of their lives attests that effective polygamy established itself, and it did so undoubtedly for reasons of concupiscence. In the story of David, who also had several wives, what is striking is not only the fact that he had taken the wife of one of his subjects, but also the clear consciousness of having committed adultery. This fact, as well as the king's repentance, are described in a detailed and suggestive way from 2 Samuel chapter 11, verses 2 through 27. By adultery, one understood only the possession of another's wife, but not the possession of other women as wives next to the first one. The whole tradition of the Old Covenant indicates that the effective necessity of monogamy as an essential and indispensable implication of the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, never reached the consciousness and ethos of the later generations of the chosen people. On this background, one must also understand all the efforts that aimed at introducing the specific content of the commandment, you shall not commit adultery, into the framework of promulgated legislation. The books of the Bible, in which we find a full account of the Old Testament legislation, confirm this. If one considers the letter of this legislation, it becomes evident that it combats adultery decisively and without hesitation, using radical means, including the death penalty. See Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, and Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 22. Yet it does so while actually supporting effective polygamy, fully legalizing it, at least in an indirect way. Adultery is thus combated only within definite limits and within the circumference of definite premises that make up the essential form of the Old Testament ethos. In these laws, adultery is understood above all, and perhaps exclusively, as the violation of the man's property right regarding every woman who was his legal wife, usually one among many. Adultery is not understood, by contrast, as it appears from the point of view of the monogamy established by the Creator. We know already that Christ appealed to the beginning precisely concerning this matter. See Matthew chapter 19, verse 8. Very significant, in addition, is the situation in which Christ takes the side of the woman caught in adultery and defends her from stoning. He says to the accusers, "Let the one among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her." John chapter 8, verse 7. When they drop the stones and go away, he says to the woman, "Go, and from now on, do not sin again." John chapter 8, verse 11. Christ, therefore, clearly identifies adultery as sin. By contrast, when he turns to the ones who wanted to stone the adulteress, he does not appeal to the prescriptions of Israelite law, but only to conscience. The discernment of good and evil inscribed in human conscience can turn out to be deeper and more correct than the content of a legal norm. As we have seen, the history of the people of God in the Old Covenant, which we try to illustrate only with a few examples, unfolded to a remarkable degree outside the normative content placed by God in the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. It bypassed it, so to speak. Christ wants to correct these distortions, hence the words spoken by him in the Sermon on the Mount.